to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
And with that, I welcome you all. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to see a full pavilion. Welcome for this very special day, the Finance Day here in the German Climate Pavilion. You all know the numbers. It is, of course, the talk of the COP that the world needs 10 trillion US dollars annually between 2030 and 2050 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Just to realize how many zeros that number has, it is a 1 with 13 zeros, and I think that's always good to remember. But as the IPCC also explained, there is sufficient global capital to close these global investment gaps, but nevertheless, of course, there are also barriers. And with that, I welcome you here for the Finance Day here in the German Climate Pavilion, where we will debate in the next 90 minutes to 100 minutes about these barriers when it comes to redirecting, of course, capital to climate action. But, and I'm a big fan of positive psychology, we will also talk about solutions and about the way forward and the journey that we are on it together. So really to strengthen the muscles of hope, as I always say, we all need that muscle more than before. So especially today, with so much going on and the publication of the third report of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, we all know companies, capital markets, venture investors, governments, everything and everybody that is on their journey, because it's part of our lives, they have to work together, and everyone plays a vital role when it comes to financing green innovations. Again, thank you for making space in your calendars. I know the calendars are really, really busy. Thanks again for coming and for coming to the Network for Greening the Financial System, short for NGFS Finance Day Event. So thanks again for you to come here. All right, let's have our official start, and of course the official welcome by the chair of NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System. She's also the first deputy governor of the Deutsche Bundesbank, the central bank of the Federal Republic of Germany. Please welcome her with a round of applause. Sabine Mauderer.
Yeah, thank you very much, and very warm welcome from my side. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends. On behalf of the Global Network of Central Banks and Supervisors for Greening the Financial System, I'm delighted to welcome you to this exciting event. And first of all, I would really like to thank my dear colleagues from the German federal government for providing us with this space. I do not take this for granted. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to discuss the recent developments, challenges, and of course also opportunities in green finance. But before I start, I would like to explain to some of you who have never heard of NGFS, or Network for Greening the Financial System, what kind of animal are we and who we are. So actually, we are an organization of now 140 central banks and supervisory agencies. We were founded 7 years ago in the aftermath of the Paris Agreement. And the goal of of the central banks, is to better understand climate risk, nature-related risk, and to address them towards the financial community and to mitigate these kind of risks. So this is in a nutshell who we are and what we do. Well, in the run-up to COP29, I heard one question many times, and that is, will Baku be the finance COP? And I must admit that I find this question quite odd, because in my view, every COP is a finance COP. When we talk about the green transition, we must talk about how to finance it, and the same is true for adaptation. Well, fossil fuels have driven industrial developments and powered many of our economies for 2 centuries. Weaning our economies off of coal, gas, and oil requires a fundamental transformation. The technical solutions to decarbonize economic activities are on the table, but we are not yet channeling enough capital into these solutions. To replace fossil fuel-driven plants, machineries, engines, large-scale investments are needed across the world. So, how much money are we talking about? And I know that there are many numbers around, but let me just take one number. The Climate Policy Initiative, CPI, estimates that annual climate finance investments of between $5 trillion and $11 trillion will be needed starting now to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We will not find these amounts in public coffers alone, no matter how deep we dig. The financial system as a whole will need to be involved. And according to the London Stock Exchange, financial markets currently provide $250 trillion in credit and equity. So what does that mean? In other words, the financial system has the means to mobilize the necessary capital. The trillion-dollar question is, how can this capital be unlocked to finance the green transition? And how can we create incentives for financial markets to shift the trillions? Article 2.1, and to be very precise, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement reflects this when it calls for making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions. And the Paris Agreement actually, and in particular this Article 2.1, was the key reason for the establishment of our central bank network, the NGFS, 7 years ago. And back then, we set out first, understand how climate change and climate policy will affect the financial system, and on the other hand, second, on the other side of the coin, how the financial system affects climate change and climate policy. And the second point we wanted to make is to understand how central banks can contribute as guardian of price and financial stability, and as catalyst for developments in the financial system. And a few years later, so actually we started with 8 members, so 8 central banks like Germany, France, UK, Singapore, China, and a few others. And now, only 7 years later, we are 140 central banks and supervisory agency, so that was quite a journey. So I think now it's good time to revisit these questions we initially asked ourselves 7 years ago. And I'm very happy that we managed to bring together so many different stakeholders to do that today. Central bankers alongside with representatives from the financial sector, from the real economy, the civil society, and international organization. So let me briefly run you through our agenda and what we have planned for the next 3 hours. We will have an exciting discussion about the enabling role of regulation and supervision on the way to the greener financial system. And I'm really looking forward to the insights that this will provide. This is, I think, a crucial topic in particular for those of us with responsibilities for supervising financial institutions, but not only. Then we will also explore what insights the NGFS can offer to the financial sector more broadly, So we will have a look at the NGFS scenarios, and they are now widely used for both the public and the private sectors to better understand the economic and the financial impacts of climate change. And we just published a few days ago the new vintage of these scenarios based on the most recent data. And maybe just to explore or to explain to many of you, what are these scenarios? Some of you get bored because you know it already, but I would really to get everyone on board. So the scenarios of the NGFS are our flagship product. And what we do there is we analyze different scenarios. So the current policy scenarios, what do the current policies mean in economic terms, be it GDP, inflation, output, productivity, unemployment, and so on. But not only current policy, we also have a look at a maybe fragmented world. What do we see if Europe has different policies in place than the US or other parts of the world, and so on. And then, of course, we also have a scenario like, what if we see a global backlash in climate policy and end up on a hot house world? What would that mean besides the human tragedy in economic terms? And we do have a vintage, I think, every second year. And the most recent updates we published just last week. And just to give you a little insight on one number you might remember, that is, in the scenario of the current policies, we risk losing 15% of global GDP to the physical impact of climate change. So 15% of global GDP by 2050. And just to make sure that you understand this number only includes the economic impact of droughts, floods, hurricanes, and some other events. But it does not include sea level rises, not include tipping points, not include migration, climate migration, and a lot of other issues, socio-economic issues. So the number might be even higher. So let's see what the next vintage will show us. In addition to these scenarios, we'll take a closer look at climate data with a presentation of the upcoming NGFS Data Directory 2.0. And this directory is going to provide a crowdsourced data catalog with well over 700 climate-related data sets. And we will show it, and we think it's a public good, so we are happy to share this immense data set. And this project underscores our commitment to improving access to climate data. As I said, it is really meant to be a public good and accessible to many of you. Well, we will conclude this afternoon with a high-level panel that will delve into the big questions I touched upon earlier. So, where do we stand on the way to a greener financial system? Are the trillions really shifting? Well, but first, before we go to our panels, I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Bo Lee. Bo, you are Deputy Managing Director at the IMF. You are responsible of the IMF's work on about 90 countries and a wide range of policy issues. Bo, it's a real honor to have you here. With your immense expertise, you are perfectly positioned to set the scene for our discussions by connecting the challenges of climate change, development, and transformation needs in the financial sector. Dear Bo, thank you for joining us. The stage is yours.
Hello, thank you, Sabine, for inviting me. Let me first congratulate the NGFS You have done important work. It is hard to believe this group has been around for only 7 years. The NGFS has achieved notable developments in our understanding of climate change, physical and transition risks. The IMF has been pleased to collaborate with you. And as a former central banker myself, I see a lot of value that NGF adds in identifying good practices and analyzing and managing climate-related financial risks. While governments have the primary responsibility and tools for addressing climate change, within their mandate, central banks and supervisors can do a lot to help within their mandates. Today, I would like to talk about how NGFS members can strengthen collaboration with each other and with the IMF to help manage the physical and transition risks and mobilize capital for low-carbon investments. Reducing climate risks through policy action proactively is easier than dealing with the consequences of climate change later. Specifically, there are 3 priority areas for action that I would like to highlight today. First, all countries must urgently adopt more ambitious targets to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Promises are not enough. We need concrete policies that will deliver on such promises. The ideal policy package would be centered on a robust carbon pricing, rising gradually and predictably to a global average of at least $85 per ton by 2030. IMF staff analysis suggests that delaying the transition even a couple of years will substantially increase the economic costs and heighten the risk of a disorderly transition in which carbon taxes would have to be ratcheted up quickly. Why am I talking about fiscal policy to a monetary audience? Because in a disorderly transition, central banks would have to grapple with much larger energy price shocks. The high uncertainty that would prevail in such an environment would weigh heavily on investor and on consumer confidence, and also on overall economic growth, ultimately impacting monetary policy. So, it is critical for NGF members to warn off and prepare for the risk of failing to advance an orderly green energy transition. Let me now come to my second priority, which is climate finance. The path to net zero by 2050 requires low carbon investments to rise from $900 billion in 2020 to $5 trillion annually by 2030 for mitigation alone. IMF analysis shows that the private sector's share of climate finance must rise from 40% to between 80 and 90% of the total in emerging markets and developing countries by 2030. To reach the investment scale needed, we must overcome barriers that hold back private sector investors, particularly the risk profile of climate investment in countries where the macroeconomic, policy, and institutional backdrop is often challenging. Governments must play their part. In addition to getting the carbon price right, governments need to strengthen macroeconomic fundamentals, deepen financial markets, improve policy predictability, and foster institutional and governance frameworks. For NGFS members, there is a role to play in helping the public sector, multilateral development banks, and the private sector collaborate in several ways on improving climate data disclosure, public-private risk sharing, on developing innovative financing structures, such as blended finance, and on broadening the investor base, including by lowering barriers for investing in emerging market and developing countries. And my third and final priority is green technological innovation and diffusion. Green innovation is not only good for mitigating climate change, but also good for stimulating economic growth. This may be because green technologies often require complementary innovation. More innovation usually means more economic growth. The world has seen decades of progress in green innovation and deployment. For example, for every $1 invested in fossil fuel today, $1.7 is invested in clean energy. 6 years ago, this ratio was 1-to-1. The challenge is that we need many more clean energy investment, and we need them fast. IMF research has found that the more climate policies a developing country adopts, the more FDI it attracts into low carbon technologies, such as renewable energy and electric vehicle production. Mexico and Thailand, for example, both saw a surge in FDI for EVs after they passed major EV legislation, such as production subsidies and incentive for charging stations. Vietnam, another example. Since Vietnam began passing a suite of climate policies in 2015, the country's renewables and industry have drawn over $1 billion per year in announced FDI. As I just mentioned, this is important because green innovation is not only good for containing climate change, but also good for stimulating economic growth. Finally, let me say one word on international cooperation. No country or institution can tackle the climate challenge alone. We must build economic resilience, which means we have to fight against protectionism and further fragmentation. Policy debates on the role of central banks in addressing climate change have grown rapidly in recent years. And I trust this panel will provide useful guidance and insights on how we can continue to move forward. Every stakeholder has a role to play, and I know that we as central bankers and the international financial institution, we also want to do our part. Thank you.
and for making the time in these busy days in your calendar. Bowley, again, thank you. Well, for the first panel, I'd like to introduce and to welcome you on stage, Aaron Vermeulen, Marty McBride, Irene Helmsgett, and Mathilde Mesnard. I'm going to do the introduction in a second here on stage, but please join me here on stage. Find your way through the crowd and join me, please. Thank you so much. Welcome. Hello, yes. Great to have you. We are complete. Great. Yay. Again, for the new faces in the back, we do have still some empty chairs. Join us in our German Climate Pavilion. Now with our first panel, diving into the essential role when it comes to financial regulation and the supervision in supporting the transition to a greener economy. And with that question, I welcome you once again here on stage. So, to your right-hand side here on stage with us is Aaron Vermeulen. You are the Global Practice Lead Finance of the World Wildlife Fund, and you are responsible for the Sustainable Finance Strategy globally. Thanks again for being here with us. Then, joining to the left-hand side, we're doing a little bit of ping-pong. Mathilde Mesnard, thank you again for joining. You're the Deputy Director for the Environment Directorate and the OECD Coordinator for Climate and Green Finance. Then we do have Irene Helmsgett with us, the head of the Climate Change Center of the European Central Bank. And last, but definitely not least, Marty McBride is also with us, the Chief of Strategic Affairs and Capacity Building at IFRS, and that means at IFRS Foundation, very important, the International Financial Reporting Standard Foundation, which is a not-for-profit public interest organization established to develop high-quality, but also globally accepted accounting and sustainability standards. But of course, we will hear more about that in a second. So when we start into our panel now, I would love to start with a table round, so to say, with the first round when it comes to: is the financial system really ready to support the transition? And in which way, of course, can regulation enable the path to what we all need, a more Paris-aligned financial sector? So, Irene, I'd like to start with you. Let's have a look. Let's dive into the view from within, as I would call it, speaking about regulation and supervision. The NGFS synthesis report it's also a special look where we have to see, and maybe you can shed a light on that, mentioning the importance of transparent extra-financial reporting and the integration of climate risk in financial supervision. So what's currently on your desk, and of course, what are you fighting for in that climate finance COP? But as we've already heard, every COP is a finance COP, but nevertheless, how special is this COP29 in that regard for you?
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. I really recommend everyone to read this synthesis report. I think it provides a great insight of where we stand. Are we really increasing the finance of climate? I think this is really, really important. And if I look into the regulatory developments over the past 10 years, I think the progress has been really, really immense. Like 10 years, there was hardly anything. 5 years ago, more lights in the darkness. And I think where we are now, especially on the area of disclosure, and I'm sure Marty will tell more about that, it's been great. Progress has really been pushed by market-led initiatives. So that's also, I think, important to notice. It's not only coming from governments, also market-led initiatives really paved the way, TCFD and all the other disclosure requirements, and again here Marty was really one of the pioneers in that field. But also GFANZ, green bond standards. But it's really time that it grows up and it matures and it becomes mandatory and it's become meaningful, it becomes reliable and comparable. I think then when regulatory environments brings that to us, it helps us also to channel financial flows. But on your question, what is on my desk now, and talking about supervision, because I think the NGFS has been really instrumental also on collecting practices, what is happening all around the globe on the supervisory side. I had the pleasure of leading the first NGFS report on integrating climate and environmental risk into supervision. That was in 2020, this report came out. And if you see where we stand now, this is big. And at the ECB, we're really pushing banks hard to manage the risk, because the risks are there. We issued our supervisory expectations in 2020, so that's the same time that the first NGFS guide came out. And now 2024, we set the deadline. We want all banks, so those are all the big banks around all of Europe, to meet all our supervisory expectations. And I think this one is a novelty. We also said we won't shy away of issuing periodic penalty payments if you don't comply. So this is how serious we are about it, how mature it got. So I think this is an important one. We've done stress testing and other climate stress testing on the macro side, on the micro side. Also on our own balance sheets, because I think it's also to mention that we have to practice what we preach, and we also have risk ourselves, of course, we have to manage coming from climate. Lastly, I want to say on this, on supervision, risk is our mandate. So we can't say, banks, you can't invest in that, or you have to be fully Paris aligned. We do have to identify the risk. So that's why it's so important that there is regulation out there that lays the path out for the real economy to transition. And also to see the transition risk there, to see the physical risks happening. So we're in this ecosystem. I think it was mentioned in the introductory statements already, to really make, we're bringing in the risk side from the ECB, from the NGFS, but having the real economy manage transition to Paris, I think that's needed to really get the financial flows moving.
Thank you. Irene mentioned practicing what you preach. And Mathilde, I'd like to come to you, coming, of course, with the view of an international organization. Let's have a look into your perspective coming from the OECD when it comes to supporting, on the one hand, governments, but also, of course, different international bodies in raising ambition, but also to improve the climate action, to really bring it forward when it comes to mitigation, building up this muscle of resilience, when it comes to adaptation, finance. What do you do, and what is on your desk when it comes to policy recommendations, to analysis and data?
Okay, first I would like to thank the NGFS to inviting the OECD to this discussion. We are doing a lot together, and it's good to join forces to drive the financial systems towards more climate alignment. But to answer your question, your first question, whether the current financial system is aligned or not, we have just published a review on that. And in a nutshell, the answer is a big no. The financial system is not aligned, is still grossly misaligned, in spite of all the efforts that you were mentioning, in spite of all the progress. So what we see in a nutshell is that in many segments, when we do have the data, we see that usually more finance is going to misaligned activity than to aligned activity. And in many segments of the financial sector, we don't have the data. We don't know. There are key line blind spots. So we still need to do a lot. So that's my first message. But of course, a lot has been done. And we have looked at all the policies in the financial sector, climate-related policies. And we have seen that currently, I mean, 2023, we have 81 countries and the EU who have adopted financial sector policies integrating climate considerations. And this number was only 18 when the Paris Agreement was signed. So yes, we see a lot of policy actions, a lot. But we see most of this policy action is in the area of transparency and information disclosure. We have 55 countries with climate-related disclosure policies, and 70 countries adopting climate-related finance guidelines such as taxonomies. We see also some integration of climate-related considerations in prudential and monetary policy, but at a much slower pace, in a much more careful way, I would say, with only 41 jurisdictions having this type of policies. But what our review shows also is that we really don't know what is the effect of these policies. It's very difficult to seriously, look at the impacts of these policies. And we know that these financial sector policies have financial and price stability as well as market integrity and efficiency as their primary objectives. But of course, we hope that they do influence the climate outcomes. But our current understanding of these effects on the climate outcomes is really primarily based on conceptual analysis and assumptions, not yet data. So we have very limited research that shows mixed effects and trade-offs, in fact, between the core financial and climate policy objectives, especially for the policies that are related to the level and quality of capital and credit operations. And we also have some data showing that, it's not data here, it's really more like conceptual research that expects potentially positive effects across financial and climate policy objectives for climate-related disclosure, for stress testing, and for large exposure policies. So I think if we want to improve our understanding of the readiness and the capacity of our financial system to really push forward our climate ambitions and realize our climate objectives, we need to invest much more time and efforts in improving the empirical evidence on the actual effects and the trade-offs of climate-related financial sector policies. That's my...
Let's stop here. A lot of keywords. We're coming back to these in a second round. Thank you so much for that first impression. Well, Aaron, let's come to you. You know, we are two geologists here on the stage. You're one and I'm one. And talking about being, of course, a part of the architecture when it comes to green finance. The World Wildlife Fund is very actively engaged as well. So please share with us also parts of your work, especially when it comes to the analytical work that the World Wildlife Fund is implementing and that the WWF is carrying out under its so-called Sustainable Financial Regulations and Central Bank Activities Framework, short for SUSREC. I have to read that out. So please join us. Why is it so important to keep that on the reading list? And especially, why is it important in actually not just reading it, but really filling it with life in building a good basement, a solid basement for green finance?
Good, thank you. Yeah, and congratulations, you discovered my background. I was a bad geologist, so that's why I turned to finance. So
soil and water, hydrologist as well, right?
15 years ago. But yeah, so am I audible? Yeah. So WWF is developing this Sustainable Regulation Initiative, which is a kind of a benchmark of 15 banks worldwide to really see how banks in the global north, but also the global south are doing. And in the past 4 years, actually, with the good news, we've seen some incredible progress, like what Irene said. And I think also that's to a large part can be contributed to the NGFS, not to WWF. So you guys have been doing a fantastic job in pushing the bar and creating a level playing field. So well done. But we mainly see progress on Pillar 2 and 3. And then mainly on managing risks, disclosures, transition plans, targets, and taxonomies. And yeah, then the bad news, we also still see some gaps, right? So on Pillar 1, still very little progress, and we really commend the advice from the EIOPA to increase the capital surcharge for insurance and pension funds with 17% for equities and 40% for bonds when there's a high exposure to fossil fuels. So that's a kind of a signal that I hope central banks and supervisors are adopting. Then also on the high income, high emitting countries, we still see central banks and supervisors are lagging behind compared to their peers. Then also the insurance sector is going not as fast as the banking sector. That's also what came out of our SUSREC report. And then finally, we see very little attention to nature, right? And it's a very intertwined and dual crisis and risk. Very little regulation supervision on nature. So that's all coming out of the SUSREC report. You can download it. It's just been launched, and invite you to have a look at that.
Thank you, Aaron. Marty, last but not least, of course, I'd like to include you as well in our panel when it comes to building up the basement for the solid green financial system. I've mentioned before that you are joining us today from the International Financial Reporting Standard Foundation. And of course, the standards are developed by two standard-setting boards, the so-called IISB and the ISSB, and we'd like to dive into the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, working towards achieving what we're discussing, this architecture, this house of a green financial system. Again, what is, from your perspective, a top priority, also combining this question with a little second question on how to include the private actors and the private sector, because that is a lot talked and debated in the corners of the COP. So what is your take on that?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to NGFS, but all of you in the room that have helped make the 3 years. It's 3 years, it's our 3-year birthday, Climate Finance Day at COP, since the IFRS Foundation took that step to set up the International Sustainability Standards Board and do what they did for sustainability, for accounting standards 25 years prior. So happy birthday to the team, and thank you all for coming on the journey with us. So at the IFRS, we're working really hard to accelerate the adoption of our first two inaugural standards, the S1 and IFU2 if you like. So the house standard and the climate standard, to break it down quite simply, and create a sort of a global baseline, or as a passport, if you like, for companies to meet the requirements globally for providing investors with a global baseline of disclosure information to help inform investment decisions. And as we're sort of been talking today, we've now managed, and it's quite a milestone this week for us as well. We now have over 50% of GDP and 50% of global emissions covered by the standards, and sort of committed to bringing them into their jurisdictions. And I'm also delighted to say that I've just spent a couple of hours with the finance officials here in Azerbaijan, and they will look like becoming 31 as they explained the standards to me and talked me through them. So, no one's ever done that before. I was delighted. They knew more than I did almost. Absolutely fantastic that we're making that real shift and real progress, because I don't think anyone thought it was going to happen quite this quickly. So this shift that we're seeing from voluntary to mandatory is really important for moving finance, and that is because, and I should say, the shift from voluntary to mandatory alongside the new assurance standards that are out from the IAASB, because we really want this to result in the increase in the availability of robust, material, decision-useful, sustainability-related information. And that shift is really important from voluntary to mandatory, because if you had been looking around on Tuesday, and another one for your reading list if you like, we launched the Progress on Climate-related Disclosure Report, which is the successor to the, if you like, the TCFD status report that we all became very familiar with receiving in our inboxes on an annual basis. And that Progress was looking at how we're going with this, climate disclosure. And in that, we looked at over 3,800 of the largest companies via Bloomberg's sort of terminals, so what you would expect to see, you're all familiar with it. And on all of the 11 TCFD recommendations, we saw that less than 3% of those companies were disclosing every one of them, which indicates that if climate information is material to investors, they're currently not getting that information that they need to assess and price climate-related risks and opportunities. And that's really key for the conversation today. But more alarmingly, we are seeing more than 20,000 companies report this data to CDP, but less than 1%, less than one of those 3,888, less than only 80% of that 3,800 companies were reporting 1% of that metric, and 42% were reporting 5%. So we still have a long way to go, and I think that really will be that shift from voluntary to mandatory that will make it happen. And I promise I'm about to stop talking. But another sort of lever we're moving at the moment to help this space is the support we're putting in place around sort of creating norms and trying to continue to harmonize the reporting landscape, which is continue to be a real theme around this. And we have brought in-house the Transition Plan Task Force recommendations on transition plans to update them as guidance to our standards and hopefully try and reduce further fragmentation in that place and create a global norm, if you like, that supports the agendas we're talking about today.
Thank you, Marty, and thanks to all for that first round. Mathilde, I'd like to touch on some keywords that you mentioned earlier. I hope you can understand me well. We are, I think, fighting against some dancers behind us. But yeah, it's a dance. It takes two to tango or more in that building up the green finance. Nevertheless, you mentioned the review, the OECD review on aligning finance with climate goals. And this review had, as I understood, 3 really core questions. And now coming from the readiness and discussing the readiness of the financial systems to the policy recommendations when it comes to, of course, how is climate alignment of finance assessed and what do we know about the flows and the stocks and what evidence exists. Can you touch upon again on the policy recommendations in a nutshell, something that we should all take away? What should we write down on a little post-it? Because we are all lacking time, but when it comes to policy recommendation from an international body like the OECD, what is something as a policy recommendation to write down on a little post-it?
Yes, let me go back to this, the results and that I was mentioning before. Like, we have still key blind spots. And some of these key blind spots is first like to have the data gaps around like some key asset classes, such as private equity. There we don't know what's happening. We have no clue really. And we do have some clue that some of the misaligned sector are getting more and more finance through private equity. We also don't have enough data on misaligned finance flows and stocks beyond the energy sector. And we are also missing data on risk of greenwashing in green labeled finance in all the different asset classes. So what needs to be done on this basis? Very quickly. Maybe our key policy recommendation per se is like, we need to develop mandatory disclosure requirements, mandatory disclosure requirements that are interoperable across jurisdictions, and that's where Marty's work is fundamental. And we need to, in doing so, address greenwashing concerns to support both the financial integrity and the environmental integrity. So these requirements need to cover key complementary metrics that relate to impacts on emissions and also on resilience to climate change. I would say that's the key policy recommendation. Of course, we have other recommendations for other actors, but maybe I'll stop here. Okay.
Thank you. No, it's wonderful because, Irene, I saw you nodding, but is there something where you say, oh, I have a point where I disagree, or where would you really see the underlining support? Is there something where you agree or where you disagree?
It's always more exciting if someone disagrees on a panel, but I'm afraid that filling these gaps that was highlighted is really the key, the regulatory framework. Where is the data really missing? And sometimes if we're pushing too much on the regulated financial sector, will there be unintended consequences that the non-regulated sector will step in and then there will be no push for greening? So those are kind of elements that we really need to capture, creating and keeping a stable regulatory environment. This is also really key. Like if there is for example, for airlines to have a certain percentage of their fuel coming for sustainable jet fuel in this amount of years, keep it, and then you'll have the innovation funded to create this demand that is not there yet, right? So that's this stable regulatory environment. Avoiding fragmentation, I think you alluded to that. So those are 3 things. But if I look like, where do I really think, which areas are needed? I think we've been focusing a lot on what is green, while we still need to we're not living in a green economy yet. So how do we really transform the hard to abate sectors? right? The high energy intensive firms, the cement producers, the steel producers, how are they going to do the transition? This is important for our competitiveness and keep our economy running. The other point that I really want to see progress in is transition plans. I think we mentioned it. This is really where I see more push is needed, and also to make this more working together. The last point I have there is, and that's to Aaron's point, not only climate, right? Nature is important. This morning I was with Sean in a panel on the need for adaptation. That's the other big topic we need to deal with. And then the just transition, it comes up more and more, but all those kind of elements, what is it, how are we really keeping everyone on board?
Thank you. That brings me to Aaron, because Aaron, when I was stalking you on LinkedIn, finding out that you're a geologist and well, sorry, excuse me. But talking about green markets, you were highlighting the economic value when it comes to the capital of nature. And you said, I quote, "I believe we can still secure a part of globe's natural capital by highlighting its economic value, but we must build partnerships." And you are, when I continued to see that you are followed by, heading to an event after this event, when it comes to innovative climate instruments, talking about blended finance, where do you see the most important priority to create that green economy that you were just mentioning, to nudge that green economy forward?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, because that's my favorite topic. But I think, so it's in WWF we have a dual strategy. So we have greening finance and financing green. Yeah, so while regulation, adoption of disclosures, transition plan is very important, you also need then to assure financial companies that they are not ending up with empty portfolios, right? So WWF is very active in the Global South to also work on supply chains of listed companies and actually where the stuff is being produced, but also where nature exists. So maybe I can give you one example of a blended finance instrument. So that started about 6 years ago with a 200 million grant from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. We set up a consortium with 2 NGOs and one private equity firm, 1 development bank, to mobilize private capital towards climate adaptation and nature. And the promise was that we would mobilize 2 billion after 6 years. So the fund is in operation for 6 years now. We haven't hit the 2 billion gap target, but we are at 1.5 now. The Dutch Development Bank got a 100 million guarantee from the European Union, so that will unlock a $250 million again. And these projects are actually originated not only by the financial companies but also by the 2 NGOs. So we have boots on the ground. We understand the climate and nature-related risks. We know the private sector in these countries. We know regulatory issues, and so we are putting a lot of emphasis on origination.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Last but not least, as we are slowly wrapping up, I know 30 minutes are just too short to really have to find all the solutions to all the questions that are in these halls. But again, thanks for joining. Last but not least, Marty, I'd like to come back to the gaps, regulation gaps, and also always the question, who's lacking in our conversation? Because we need bridge builders to bridge the gaps, especially in regulation. First of all, how do we do it? I mean, that's a very difficult question. Please keep it short. But also maybe, I know. But also, who would you like to talk to? And who's missing in our debating rooms sometimes, to also bridge the gaps?
Wow, that's another huge question.
I know,
We've got like 2 minutes, so let me go quick. I guess my one request from regulators would be, and you'll expect me to say this, is, bring the IFRS sustainability standards in as unedited as absolutely possible into your jurisdiction with as little deviation as you can to create that global baseline and level playing field and build up from then. So that's my request to regulators. But I also lead capacity building, and I do capacity building with regulators right around the world. And I think we need to encourage them to lean in and reach out and ask for help when they need it, because if we don't get the enforcement of these issues in the markets, then we're really not going to see the progress we need to at the pace we need to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I need to stop here because we have, of course, a full program. Merci beaucoup, Mathilde Misner. Thank you. To Maddie McBride, thank you for being very concrete in the end. And we go on from here. Irene, thank you again for joining. And of course, last but not least, Aaron. Merci beaucoup. This is your round of applause. Thank you. We are now diving into our next panel while we quickly reset the stage. Of course, the future is uncertain. We just talked about how to build up the green finance. We experienced this very uncertain future in the last days and in the last week. I'm in your way, right? Okay, I'm just here on the side. Ladies and gentlemen, again, for the new faces, thanks again for joining for this very high-level event. We listened to the NGFS Scenarios earlier, and this is really a report that you should read because these scenarios provide a window into different plausible futures when it comes to climate change, as it is one of the defining challenges of our lives, not just today, but also, of course, for the next generation. So the topic now coming on stage is how to reach to net zero and how can these NGFS scenarios inform and explore a range of plausible outcomes of climate finance. You know, I'm, as I mentioned earlier, an ambassador for positive psychology, so we also should look into the opportunities and possibilities. Let's hear more about it, and for that I hand over to the NGFS Workstream Scenario Design and Analysis Chair, to Livio Straka, who will moderate that panel.
So thank you, Kathy, and I don't know if you hear me, perhaps better like this. Okay, super. Okay, so let me, first of all, thanks for the invite, and also, you know, we switch, as Kathy said, to the NGFS scenarios, and let me introduce the panelists. So could the panelists, you know, come on stage? Yeah. Thank you. Hi. Okay, so as a general remark, the NGFS scenarios, you know, has been, first of all, they've been released like about a week ago, and Sabine referred to it. But also, you know, we are making also an effort to put them more into the financial sector, in the private sector. So far they've been used more in the public sphere, but we would like to, you know, to make it more accessible for the private sector. And so this is also the logic of these panels. It's about more the use in the private sector. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. So perhaps starting from my left. So Lea is currently Director of Environmental Sustainability at Aviva, which is mainly an insurance group. And you worked also in the Finnish group for, I'm told, 14 years, and you were the head of climate and nature risk. So you have, you know, plenty of experience, of course, on this. And then to my right, Otmar Edenhofer is the Director of Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute, which, by the way, is part of our climate consortium preparing the scenario. So I also would like to thank the Potsdam Institute for being you know, a partner for us. You also have been co-chair of the Working Group 3 of the IPCC, which won the Nobel Prize, so big role. And also, you also co-chair of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, which I think I understand as the task also to track whether Europe is delivering on its commitments. And last but not least, we have James, who is currently head of climate change and NatWest Group, which is a bank mainly. And you are involved in the climate transition plan at NatWest, but also you have been in the World Bank as well as a director of climate change. And also, what I am very impressed, you also have a degree in chemistry, I'm told. So, which means that you understand much more than me on the substance. Okay, so also, you know, I would like to ask the panelists to be relatively rapid, because I would like to leave the floor a few minutes for questions from the audience at the end. So I will be grateful to follow you. You know, are concise, so we can give the floor to the audience. So I guess the first question, it would be like the current use of the scenarios. So how they are currently used in the private sector. Perhaps I would start with James. So what's broadly your experience at NatWest in using climate scenarios and maybe the NGFS scenarios?
Yeah, thank you very much, and great to be with you all. Not sure I remember much of my chemistry, to be honest with you, but as somebody once said, the future is just, the present is just the future with a narrow distribution. And I think in many ways, the power of scenarios is to start seeing that future distribution and how it applies back to the present. We've been engaging very closely with the NGF scenarios in the preparation of our climate transition plan. And we've used them as the foundation for our internal climate scenario exercises, and including for capital adequacy planning, which obviously is a really important part of what banks do. We adjust them to meet specific requirements, in particular around the time horizon, and we're really interested in seeing future work around short-term scenarios as well as longer-term scenarios, and also the level of stress severity as well. So we think that's extremely important, and my personal view is that we're probably underestimating future stress severity, and I think we're building that into future narrative scenarios, which I think is quite important. But overall, we think it's a great resource. It gives us internal consistency, which we think is very important. It plays well, of course, with the regulator as well, and links to a consistent global picture, which is very foundational for the work that we're doing.
Thank you, James. And let me then turn to Leah for the insurance sector. So can you share your experience also in terms of transition maybe, or generally how you use the scenarios?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question. So Aviva is actually very, very unique because we're an insurer, but we're also an investor. So when we think about the kind of climate-related risk, it actually can affect both the asset and the liability side of our balance sheet. Now, we've been reporting against TCFD since 2016, and that's kind of the first sort of document where we started to kind of talk about and articulate our approach to scenario analysis. And what we use at Aviva is a climate value at risk metric, or CVAR as it's called. And what this is a forward-looking metric that looks at the impact on an investment portfolio under different scenarios. One of the things it does, it sort of assesses financial risk, exposure and resilience of our kind of business model and strategies to different kind of scenarios within a given time frame. But I think there's an important distinction to make because we got a fairly complex business model, we got quite a varied investment portfolio, and we're very much of the view that, you know, one size does not fit all. You kind of need to include a number of different sort of qualitative and quantitative tools in your analysis. So if I give you an example, if you're looking at your listed equity or credit portfolio or the real estate portfolio, climate VAR is a useful metric. If you're looking at sovereign debt, for example, where you've got to really assess that sort of countrywide exposure to climate-related risk, you know, you need to look at other sort of sources of information. So we use, for example, research from the University of Cambridge, the Bennett Institute of Public Policy, to do that sort of analysis. When you think about on the life insurance liability side of our book, we use a lot of internal data, we use a lot of internal judgments to sort of really sort of stress test that book around things like changing mortality rates, for example. So using a sort of a mix of quantitative and qualitative tools. Now, in terms of transition planning, I think to kind of to hone in specifically on your question, we're quite busy on this at the moment. We published our transition plan, our first transition plan back in 2022, and we're in the process of coming up with our second version, which we're publishing in 2025. We really see this as a strategic exercise, not a disclosure or a compliance exercise. In addition to kind of a lot of the quantitative analysis that we've undertaken, we've started to kind of build into our business planning process qualitative scenario analysis, so looking at our individual business units and how they're incorporating and considering kind of qualitative scenarios within their plans. And the intention vision is that we can bring all of these insights and outputs together to really kind of look at that group level risk and then understand, do you need to refine that group strategy and also kind of the underlying actions that you need to take. Probably one final point I'll probably make is, and it's very much a live discussion internally at Aviva, is how do we want kind of users of the plan to kind of interpret this information? And I think we're very, very keen that users of the transition plan understand that our decarbonization strategy and our climate risk management strategy, they're not sort of mutually exclusive. They're very much interdependent.
Very, very good point also. So one thing that also I wanted to emphasize in the new scenarios, and this was already mentioned briefly by Sabine, is in the current release, in the current vintage, we have much higher losses on GDP coming from climate change. So the losses have been revised up by a good kind of maybe 100%. So they are more than double what they had before. And this is due to new science, new evidence on the effects of climate change. And this, of course, has also an effect on all the variables in the scenarios. But generally, so in the latest science tell us that the climate change is more important for the economy than we thought before. So here I'd like to ask Otmar, in the light of this, first of all, if you are surprised by this kind of upgrade of economic losses. And also, what could be the implication for public policy? So, how do you see? So, what implication would you draw from that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think let me elaborate a little bit on the current update of the climate damages, because this seems to me is an incredibly important insight. And if we go back 10 years ago, we would perceive climate change as, let's say, as a very minor issue, which is equivalent to a flat income tax, right? If you look at the Nordhaus model, climate change works like a flat income tax. It's not a big issue, not very. It should not be ignored, but it's not a very important issue. Now, what we did is in the new climate damage function, which comes from the most recent study which we have published in Nature, it tells us when we basically take into account regional granular data, we have to update the damages significantly, up to 20% GDP losses by 2050 compared to a scenario without climate change. This is really significant. I would like to emphasize here one point. As economists, we like to use one metric. And this is a very telling metric, the social costs of carbon. If you translate these damages in the social costs of carbon, so we get a number more than $1,000 per ton CO2. What does this metric tell us? It tells us that how much damage is caused by one additional ton in the atmosphere. It's more than 1,000, and in some of the scenarios, $2,000 per ton CO2. So if you compare in your scenarios the highest carbon prices, which are consistent with net zero, they are high by 2050, but much lower than the social costs of carbon. Much lower than the social costs of carbon. And this basically emphasizes and makes an argument clear, which has been made by Nick Stern in 2006, that climate protection is, from a purely economic point of view, a very valuable investment. In these scenarios, in this data, we basically have taken into account primarily the impacts of the increase of temperature. A little bit precipitation, but most of the time the temperature. If we would include more extreme weather events, mortality, and in particular the impact of extreme weather events on the asset values, we would have to update the damages even more. So that's from my point of view a very important thing to understand, that even if we take into account the transition risks, the physical risks are much more severe than that. So that's number one. But secondly, to be honest, this is a profound statement, But this does not help us too much when we want to make climate policy more feasible and acceptable. Because in the end, we will see in the transition risk a sharp increase of the carbon prices. We know from the current election in the United States, people are very much concerned about inflation. They are very much concerned about the energy prices. And therefore, what we have to do is we have to implement compensation packages. And this is a very daunting task. To compensate people who are basically exposed to the increase of carbon prices. Why is this so complicated? I would like to share with you one experience in Germany during the Ukrainian war. During the Ukrainian war, Germany has by far implemented the largest compensation package since the Second World War, by far. We did a survey and asked the people, so how do you feel about the increasing prices and what do you think about the compensation package? People didn't realize they have been compensated. People knowing it was such a complicated compensation scheme because we had no software, we had no channel, because of administrative reasons that people do not understand they have been compensated. And this basically leads to a sharp increase of the support of the very right-wing populists. And this is something where we have to think much more on the transition risk. In the long term, the physical risks are much more severe, but in the short term, we have to work much more to mitigate the transition risk. So this is, from my point of view, the message which I will take from this most recent studies of.
No, thank you. To say, I live in Germany, and I also didn't realize about the subsidies. So I also found out later that I was compensated, but I also didn't realize. So I'm one of those with a surprise.
I do not blame you for that.
Yeah, exactly. It's very. So I also wanted to ask Leah again on this question of higher damages. I mean, in the insurance industry, how you do see now that the science now points to much bigger damages. Is this being updated, for example, in terms of expected losses? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're already living with a lot of these physical impacts of climate change. We're seeing it first and foremost through, our customers and in the industry firsthand. It's interesting. We do a lot of research and analysis. We look at a lot of data in terms of things like flood risk, for example. And what we've seen in the last 5 years in particular, 1 in 8 households in the UK have experienced flooding. So it's a staggering number. But actually, what's the most worrying statistic that I read is that a lot of the floods are happening outside of traditional flooding seasons. So traditionally, you get a lot of floods in the UK, for example, around the autumn-winter months. We've seen about 24% of our claims now coming related to claims relating to floods in sort of July, August, so your traditional summer months. So we're very much seeing this firsthand in terms of our business. What are we doing about it? So I think first and foremost, we continue to measure the impact of these physical risks. So we have a lot of sophisticated natural cat models where we look at different sort of scenarios and different hazard events, and we kind of incorporate that within our insurance pricing. We also look at sort of what were the sort of actual weather-related losses versus the expected, and again, we kind of use that to incorporate within our insurance pricing. And I think sort of phase 5 of the NGFS Scenarios really kind of incorporates that latest climate data and that latest economic data. So it's a really quite important step forward, I think, to improve the accuracy of all those physical risk assessments that we're doing at a business level. From a sort of company perspective, we're also spending a lot of time thinking about adaptation and resilience. I listened into the earlier panel, and that sort of came through quite strongly. And there's been a lot of focus on decarbonization and mitigation, but as we kind of see Category 5 storms and freak sort of flooding in continental Europe, we need to think about adaptation and resilience. And there are a couple of tangible things that we're doing at a business level to kind of support our customers, and I'll give you 2 examples. So one of the things we've instigated is it's called the Build Back Better scheme. So it's in partnership with Flood Re. And what it does, it allows sort of customers and interventions, so customers can instill sort of flood resilient measures within their homes following a claim, and we build that into the claims process. Similarly in Canada, so we have a presence in Canada and Ireland as well. We've been looking at wildfires, so a huge amount of wildfires in Canada, and again working with the sort of wildlife wildfire defense system to really look at preventative measures. So how can we kind of adapt our homes, installing sprinklers, etc., to kind of mitigate against, that sort of hazard. But I think I always end up talking about government action, because I think we always need to have that government action and an intervention. I mean, as part of this sort of COP29 process, we've sort of called upon all parties to kind of look at their NDCs and develop their national transition plans, looking at adaptation and resilience, and also aligning it with that natural national adaptation plans. I think governments need to continually assess that physical risk, in particular from the lens of adaptation financing, because within the private sector, I think we have a critical role to play. And when we have that ongoing dialogue with government in terms of the adaptation funding gap, we can sort of play our part and support filling that gap.
Thank you. And also, I'd also would like to also mention that in Europe, the climate insurance gap is very large, and we have published a couple of papers together with EIOPA on this, and credit insurance is going to be more and more key in all these kind of physical risk damages. Okay, so perhaps let's look ahead now and let's look at the challenges also for the future. So. Perhaps starting with James. So what do you see as the key challenges in applying scenarios in banks, also for the transition perspective?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is the 30-year long-term nature of scenarios is very helpful for long-term planning. But of course, most business planning takes place over a 5-year period. So we need to sort of bring back those scenarios so that we've got a good sense of what might happen over the 5-year period. And then what we need to do, and I think what we're starting to really work hard around is, for a bank like ours, which predominantly provides senior debt, that looks backwards to risk and security, scenarios enable us to think forward in terms of what kind of security will exist in the future. It may well not be the type of asset-based security that we'd presumed in the past. And similarly, I think the other thing that we have to think about is how rapidly and significantly income streams are likely to change. And we think there's going to be huge volatility that comes as a result of climate change, both from the adaptation and mitigation perspective, and therefore we want to use the tools to start pricing that risk in our book, understanding where it sits, and then what we can do about it. And finally, I'd say that the other thing that's important is how we take overall macroeconomic scenarios and then turn them into what we call system scenarios. So how do we look below the economy-wide approach into the systems that support the transition? And by that I'm thinking of real estate, I'm thinking of both residential, where we need to decarbonize homes and buildings, mobility, where we need to rapidly roll out electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the energy system, where we'll see vast amounts more battery and grid connections, as well as the renewables. And then of course food, which is an agriculture which is under enormous pressure and strain. And this is where we think we can take risk out by looking at it from a supply chain perspective. So we work with food producers, the farmers, to help them invest in regenerative agriculture so that they have better long-term contracts with supermarkets and food processors. One case study that we've worked really hard on, and I think has got some interesting insight, is with McCain, the chip producer, where we partner with them to get cheaper finance to our farmers, and therefore the whole supply chain becomes more resilient and the risk in our book is reduced as well. And all that I think can drive from the effective use of scenarios and how we deploy them in our decision making.
No, thank you, James. And also, let me also say that one kind of key areas of work for us in the scenarios is really sectoral granularity. So, we know that this is crucial, and we had some hiccups in working on that, but it's still very high on our agenda, both on the long term, but also on the short term as well. So we are listening to you that this is key, and very important. I wanted to ask Otmar if you can give us a little bit of an idea of, from the point of view of climate science, what are the key kind of problems or limitations for climate science? Because we are often told by users of the scenarios that we are not capturing enough nonlinearities, we are not capturing tipping points, and so on. And we are told by our scientists, about the scientists with whom we cooperate, that these are not easy phenomena to deal with. So I know it's difficult in 3 minutes to give, but can you give us a bit of a flavor or where the frontier is in climate science?
Yeah, let me start. So what we are doing here in this integrated assessment models are, from an economic point of view, long-term growth models, right? Mm-hmm. But long-term growth models combined with Earth system and climate science modules. And I think it is very important that this very long-term approach should be combined with the macroeconomic models, which are basically deal with more the short-term. So the inflation rate, unemployment. So linking both aspects together. And I think this is important because indeed you can end up in the short term in a path dependency, in an equilibrium which does not allow you to continue the long-term growth trajectory. So I think that's number one. The second challenge is what I would like to call the three-pillar approach of climate policy. So in the past, we thought about two pillars: adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation means to adapt to unavoidable climate change. Mitigation means emission reduction towards the net zero. So this is the conventional approach, and this is good. But we have to make much more progress to understand, in particular, adaptation, because people argue, okay, you have taken into account the damages, but people can adapt to this. But I would say there are fundamental limits to adaptation which has to be understood much better. So you might have fragmented insurance markets, which is has a strong impact on adaptation, and even we have to take into account maladaptation. So these are aspects which are required to a better understanding. So secondly, emission reduction. So we need a reasonable understanding about the technologies. And many of the integrated assessment models have some sort of non-linearities when it comes to the deployment of technologies. Think about renewables, carbon capture, and so on. But what we are missing is the third pillar. And the third pillar is, from my point of view, incredibly important. And the third pillar is what I call the carbon dioxide removal technologies. Or you could say it's the planetary waste management. Why is this so important? It is important because it becomes increasingly clear that we are not in a position, no longer in a position, to limit the increase of global mean temperature below or around 1.5. We have to accept an overshoot for many decades. How can we manage the overshoot? How can we bend back the temperature curve? The only way is to create net negative emissions. And this is, from my point of view, the third pillar.
But is it not also an excuse not to do anything on the second pillar?
Wait a minute. Yeah. Not at all. Because the alternative is not saying, let's do more CDR instead, less mitigation. So the thing is, we are already on an overshoot trajectory. We are already overshooting. It's not a choice. It's a matter of fact. The only thing is what we can do is we have to do mitigation, and we should CDR without mitigation deterrence. But this is a very, very important pathway which helps us to limit the climate damages. Very difficult to implement, requires long-term investment, very complicated, admittedly, a very challenging governance structure, but that's important. And the crucial thing is adaptation, mitigation, and CDR interact. You cannot separate these three pillars. And to understand the linkages between them, this is the huge challenge in the future, which requires a lot of Earth system science modeling, of course, including also in the Earth system analysis tipping points. But this is something which we have to understand, and this is the future challenge. And this is something which has to be done quite soon, because we need for all that a credible governance structure which is not yet in place. And this brings me to the last point. This is thinking about governance and policies, which is, from my point of view, by far the most important challenge. To summarize, short-term, long-term, linking that, the three-pillar approach, and thinking about governance and policy instruments.
No, thank you. So in the scenarios, I guess, the adaptation is still an underdeveloped area. So, but it's not easy to really understand, how to model it. So we struggle with adaptation in general. And on the CDR, we tend to extrapolate current trends. But of course, it's again. So we don't know. I don't know also if you include geoengineering also in this category as well. So. Which is another discussion, I suppose.
Okay, now you enter in a taboo zone. Mm-hmm. For me, CDR is not geoengineering. I know there are many definitions, but there are basically now, meanwhile, a lot of proposals for solar radiation management, where basically the radiation balance on Earth should be steered directly. I would say this is something which is discussed now in science increasingly, and when basically, but this has huge risks. For example, if you deploy SRM, one country can do this unilaterally. They change the precipitation patterns in other parts of the world, which is basically a very conflictual technology. But I'm quite sure that at some stage people will come up with that proposals also in the political stage.
Yeah, this is also something that we also started to discuss, because also the governance of that is very complicated. So here, okay, so maybe why don't I give the floor a bit to the audience? Is there anybody who has questions, and then I give the panelists a last chance to react and to conclude. Yeah, please. Or okay, yeah, let's start there.
Hi, Edmund Roos-Jones from Boston Consulting Group. I lead our sustainability policy team. We've been looking at this with a view to translating some of this to corporate specifically, not finance. I just wanted to kind of double click on the tipping points piece again, because we're going to be crossing some of these tipping points almost certainly and quite soon. And if you just take the Labrador Sea Current alone, that alone would have potentially massive economic consequences. Do we have the right kind of climate science and economic modeling in order to try and get it, just one of these, to help make the case? Thanks.
Thank you. We collect some questions, but perhaps this will be more for Otmar, but let's collect some on the floor. One here, please.
Hi, Jonas Rose from Bloomberg NEF. I have a question for Otmar. Carbon pricing is central in the NGFS as the mechanism for driving transition. And I want to ask about your thoughts on the limitations of that approach. Carbon pricing is not a great proxy in many cases for climate policy. Think about internal combustion engine phase out. That's a zero price and then an infinite price, but only on the new vehicles. Even in the EU ETS, renewables is often not benefiting from carbon pricing because they are actually covered by contracts for difference. So the carbon pricing is benefiting the gas-fired power stations instead of the coal ones, not the renewables. So I'm curious about that. And then also as a mechanism, but also in the messaging, because what then becomes very easy is to say, well, the price times the volume, that's the cost of the transition, when the reality is we're often benefiting from these technologies that become much cheaper as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, okay. There was another question there.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kjell Kühne from the Leave It in the Ground initiative, Lingo. And I would like to ask a question connected to Otmar's remark about the social cost of carbon. We ran some numbers with a social cost of carbon of $400 per ton and arrived at an evaluation that 1 barrel of oil generates $175 of damages. If you take 1,000 or 2,000, that would be double that. So each barrel of oil that is burned causes $300 of damages, and nobody's leaving oil in the ground. everybody takes it out and burns it. And that raises the question whether our financial system is somehow dysfunctional. And I really appreciate Sabine's framing as looking at the big picture and saying there's 250 trillions out there, and how do we rechannel that? Because we're on a suicidal path, and that financial system is not doing its job. And I believe that in many cases, staying on the fossil fuel path is even more expensive. The colleagues from Africa, they say we can't finance because of high inflation, and country risk can't be priced by banks and so on. So they can't get the finance to do renewables, but they would be cheaper. And the IMF talks about the great carbon arbitrage and shutting down coal. How much that would generate to society. So my question is, what are new ways central banks can come into this situation, helping to unlock this suicidal model that doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make logical sense, it's just an inertia in how we have set up our institutions and how financial markets work and so on, but it needs to be unlocked somehow, and it seems like we may need some new directions and new mechanisms for unlocking that challenge. Thanks.
Oh, thank you for the question. I mean, I also would like to advertise. ECB research shows that so banks, and sorry for James, but banks as opposed to other financial intermediaries tend to lend to more polluting sectors. So if you divide the financial system into banks and non-banks, the banks is where the problem is bigger. It's much bigger.
Not our bank.
Maybe not your bank. But
we have a very good energy supply investment ratio of green to brown. But it's difficult. I mean, and I'm sorry, I've got to go because my next event's about to start, and I think we're overrunning slightly. But just, a response, I think, to the 3 points together. The economics of tipping points, yes. The financing, no. I mean, we don't have the models to deal with that, and we need to start thinking about that. Carbon pricing, necessary but not sufficient, and I think the shadow carbon pricing is a very effective way of reallocating capital. But we're not really dealing with the kind of numbers that we need to deal with, and we need to translate the shadow to the real. And I think that starts to then expose the challenges and the fallacy of investing more in fossil fuels. And I think we have an obligation to get the money to support the transition. And certainly as a bank, that's what we're doing, informed by some of the scenario planning and scenario thinking. But I do have to go, so many apologies. But thank you very much.
Thanks, James, for participating. Thank you. Perhaps I would like to ask Otmar. About this, so there was this question on the taxes versus subsidies, and then the other question also. So
yeah. 3 points. First about the tipping points. I think we have reasonable Earth system models to capture the tipping points, the natural tipping points. But one thing I would like to emphasize here: there's a huge misunderstanding about tipping points. And this basically is very misleading for the design of climate policy. Tipping points means something is activated in an irreversible way, but this does not mean that the Earth system is on a cliff and a catastrophe falls. For example, sea level rise. You activate sea level rise in an irreversible way, but it is a gradual phenomenon. And this is a very important thing, because we should think about this gradual phenomena. So if there would be one big bang catastrophe, this would be good, because then we would realize that we have crossed the tipping point. Very often we don't know when we cross the tipping point. We know that around 1.5 and 2 we might activate some tipping points. But now this brings me to another thing: is people start to say, we have natural tipping points, let's think about social tipping points. And from my point of view, I would challenge this approach, because so far what we have seen is no social tipping points at all. What we have seen is a fundamental inertia in the system, a fundamental inertia. So 10 years ago, I apologize, that sounds a little bit, let's say, a typical German professor type of response. 10 years ago, I published a paper at the Paris conference PNS about the renaissance of coal. People start to laugh at that. But now we are in the middle of a fossil fuel renaissance again. And this is something which we should basically take into account much more seriously. And this brings me back to your point. So given the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, we have an oversupply of fossil fuels. And we have to leave the majority of resource and reserves underground. But we failed dramatically. We failed dramatically at the global scale. And this was due to the fact that we thought when basically new technologies like renewables become cheaper and cheaper, so then the job is done. But this is not true. So with the new technologies, you can bring the new technologies on the market, but you fail to phase out the fossil fuel capital stock. And you need policy instruments for this. And this brings me now back to the carbon pricing. I agree. Carbon pricing might be not the one instrument which basically solves all the problem. We published a paper 3 weeks ago in Science, and we analyzed 1,500 policy packages around the globe in roughly in 50 countries over the last 2 decades. From this 1,500 climate policy packages, only 63 survived as effective. And it turns out that all these policy packages might include bans and standards, but all the successful ones had one important ingredient. This is carbon pricing. Why is carbon pricing so essential? It is essential because it helps you to phase out the fossil fuel capital stock. So, and this is important. It is not sufficient, but it is absolutely necessary. And I become really frustrated, hearing again and again in all the plenaries, people telling me, I'm not attacking you, but just you raised the question, and therefore, so people say, carbon pricing is not effective in the transport sector, is not effective in the building sector. This is not true. It is really not true. The structural break in many countries in the transport has been caused by a policy package, standards, but it was always combined with a carbon price. And this is very, and the reason is, so it helps us to phase out the fossil fuel capital stock. Many other important reasons where we need a proper design of the markets. It has to be complemented with subsidies for new technologies. But without this carbon pricing, there is no incentive to leave fossil fuels underground. And the last thing what I would like to highlight is, I'm very much in favor on the tipping point, but we should not underestimate the gradual damages done by extreme events, by productivity losses, and by mortality. This and by the devaluation of the assets. These are huge gradual changes, and we are at risk that we completely ignore this because this is a small gradual change by year, but we don't understand that we are on a trajectory where we are committed already to damages which cannot be reverted. And if you look at the new damages, they have a very sobering message. By 2050, even if we would be very successful with climate policy, the difference is small because we are committed to so much damages. After 2050, we see a fundamental departure of that, and therefore it is good that we have a climate policy. But these gradual changes are, for our mind, very complex. I would say our brain is much more trained to deal with non-linearities, but we are not very good to deal and take into account long-lasting, irreversible gradual changes. And this concerns me most.
No, thank you, Otmar, for the very passionate, but also I think right perspective from my point of view. I want to ask Elea if you have comments on this discussion.
Yeah, just one quick comment, I think, on the skills gap question. So I mean, talking from a kind of financial services background, back in, I think it was 2019, we had our regulators instill an exercise that was the CBES, so the Climate Biannual Exploratory Scenario Analysis. So within financial services, we do a huge amount of stress and scenario testing around different types of risk. We look at it from a capital management perspective. But until that was a mandated exercise by the regulators, we weren't probably doing enough. So unfortunately, within the financial services, we respond to regulation. So I think that exercise actually allowed a lot of financial institutions to really upskill and sort of bringing a lot of expertise around sort of scenario modeling. There's probably still a huge amount to do, because one of the things that we're looking at is how we kind of translate those results into kind of more decision useful information, making it useful for decision making and business planning. Two things probably to say on that. I think it's really important to kind of talk to your peer group in terms of what other organizations are doing, what challenges are they facing, how are they navigating those challenges. And secondly, really important to kind of continue to have that dialogue with the governments, with the regulators, to terms of what's coming next and providing a lot of feedback. That feedback loop is really quite important.
Thank you, Leon. Also, this is I very much share that. So let me conclude this session by thanking the panelists. It was a very interesting discussion. I just wanted to mention that the NGFS short-term scenarios, so the 1 to 3 to 5 year horizon, will be published at the beginning of the year. We don't know exactly when. It could be January, it could be March. We don't know. And these short-term scenarios are useful for the financial sector. I defer you to publication of those scenarios. And generally, yeah, this was a very interesting discussion. Perhaps I pass the floor back to Kathy for the continuation. But thanks so much.
I hope you can hear me now. Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for these insights, and thanks to Livio for moderating. Let's continue with our next 15 minutes when it comes to leveraging the power of nature and climate data, and when we talk about innovation by the NGFS. And for that, I welcome the Deputy Director and Head of Data and for Data Governance and Transformation Division at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So please join me here on stage. Harry Lee.
Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you all for tuning into this session. Just to check that I'm audible for everyone. Great, okay. So as Katie mentioned, I'm Harry Lee from the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And I am a part, very importantly, I'm a part of the Network for Greening the Financial System community. Today I have an opportunity to share with you a tool that the NGFS will be releasing that I hope will help all of us achieve some of our climate ambition. Now, we all know that climate change presents significant challenges to the global financial system. You guys here know better than me. Banks and insurers all need to manage their exposures to physical hazards like floods and wildfire. They also need to track changes in their counterparties' business models, again due to climate-related developments. And finance is also a mechanism for bringing about the change that we wish to see in line with our 1.5 degrees Celsius target. All in, I think both financial authorities and financial institutions alike will need access to reliable and consistent climate data to assess the exposure to the risk that I had mentioned, to identify possible opportunities, and also to take appropriate risk management actions. Finding and integrating this range of information from various sources is not easy. Sometimes, there are three reasons why. First, sometimes it's just because there isn't this actual climate data out there. These are actual gaps that we need to plug. It's not there, so you just can't find it. It is also possible that the relevant climate data is there, but there's just no systematic way for you to find and discover this data. This creates the perception that there is a data gap, and it could lead to climate inaction. This is something that we need to we need to seriously focus our minds on. There are also instances where there is just too much seemingly similar and relevant data, and we just don't know what to do with them. How do we compare across and pick the most appropriate data for our respective needs? Where do we focus our limited energy and resources so that we can work towards converging on a set of consistent and comparable data? I think that's the problem statement before us, and that this tool is trying to address. So what did the NGFS do? In 2020, an NGFS workstream commenced work on bridging climate data gaps. The goal then was to perform a systematic stocktake of available and desired climate data, so we can identify and bring attention to where the most pressing and acute data gaps are. And where data are available, dispel notions that there are data gaps. The workstream identified climate-relevant use cases of financial sector stakeholders, such as central banks, banks, insurers, and funds. Desired and actual metrics for these use cases, as well as the climate data and methodology needed to construct the metrics, were documented. In the course of this work, the NGFS built up and subsequently released a catalog of 1,200 climate-related metrics and 750 data sets for these use cases. This was the first NGFS data directory, or what we call Data Directory 1.0. It is a publicly available, central repository of climate information for financial services. With the passage of time, our concern is that the content on the directory has become stale. New data sets are now available, and the perception that there are data gaps continues to remain quite entrenched. So there continues to be a need for a repository of climate-relevant data. But this directory needs to be a living document, constantly updated and constantly refreshed. The NGFS is therefore building a new data directory, Data Directory 2.0. Data Directory 2.0 is intended to be a collaborative website, just like Wikipedia, where information can be crowdsourced and then curated by a community of expert users. The BIS Innovation Hub, the Banque de France, and the MAS, we are undertaking this project on behalf of the NGFS. And in 2025, we will deliver the Data Directory 2.0 as a public good. We believe that the Data Directory 2.0 will help unlock the full potential of the wealth of already existing climate data to address some of the climate use cases that we see today and further bridge climate data gaps. So let me talk a little bit about what Data Directory 2.0 is about. But I'll start with a recap of Data Directory 1.0. Briefly, Data Directory 1.0 offers users two things. First, it offers users access to a set of curated climate data with a focus on financial risk. And then there were filters to help users locate and find the specific data and metrics that they want. These filters were based on how we had organized the directory. Data Directory 2.0 will do all of that and also do more. Since launching Data Directory 1.0, we've received a lot of feedback from interested parties on how we can make the directory better. We've also heard from users how we can transform the way financial sector participants navigate their climate data needs. We've redesigned the Data Directory 2.0 based on the three principles that you see on the screen. I'll start from the top right. Firstly, collaboration. Data Directory 2.0 will be a collaborative data ecosystem. Users will be able to contribute new and update existing information. This will help to keep the directory both comprehensive and also relevant. From commercial data providers to individual researchers, there will be easy means available for them to upload both actual data as well as metadata of data that they have onto the data directory. We will accommodate a range of data ingestion methodologies as well as multiple file formats. Second, top left of the screen, user centricity. We want the Data Directory 2.0 to be a first go-to platform for financial sector participants to find the climate data that they need. We've done multiple rounds of user testing and design workshops. We believe we have an intuitive interface that users can use to easily search and find the climate data that they need. Advanced search tools will also be made available for users to find, sense make, and compare climate data on the directory. And lastly, and most importantly, community. to ensure that the crowdsourced information continues to be a trusted set of information, we will have mechanisms to form authoritative bodies from the community of users to curate information proposed for inclusion on the directory. More importantly, the Data Directory 2.0 will be a platform for interested parties to exchange views and ideas on climate data. The NGFS will invite relevant parties ranging from data providers, non-profits, academics to share and post content that could be relevant to users of the data directory. So enough of listening to me. Let me now show you a quick demonstration of the Data Directory 2.0.
The Network for Greening the Financial System has commenced a rebuild of its data directory, known as the Data Directory 2.0. This initiative will be supported by the Bank for International Settlements Innovation Hub, Banque de France, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Launched in 2022, the first version of the data directory is a catalogue of curated climate data and metrics for participants of the financial services industry. Our goal was to highlight actual data gaps and address perceived data gaps, as well as foster greater awareness of climate issues. Data Directory 2.0 aims higher. Data Directory 2.0 is envisioned to be a living and trusted repository of information on climate data and metrics, which financial sector participants can easily search and retrieve. Two key enhancements will be made. First, advanced search capabilities will allow users to easily search and discover information useful for their purposes. Users can learn more about climate metrics and the use cases these are applicable to, as well as the data and methodologies needed to construct the metrics. Users can also find out if the data is available and who the data providers are. To find pertinent information, users can filter information by data availability, as well as geography and asset classes of interest. Semantic search capabilities will also be introduced to allow for a more intuitive search experience. Second, the data directory will allow users to crowdsource information so that its content remains updated and relevant. Select users such as those from known data providers, standard setting bodies, and the regulatory community will be able to upload new or amend existing information to keep the directory updated. These users can introduce new information, one metric or data at a time, or through the bulk upload function. These new enhancements will enable the Directory 2.0 to serve as a useful tool for financial sector participants to address climate-related use cases. There will also be workflows that allow authoritative bodies to review and approve proposed contents for publication on the directory. These features ensure that the directory's content is of high quality and fit for purpose. The directory will thrive only if there is a motivated community of contributors that will expand, sharpen, and update its content. Reach out to the NGFS Secretariat if you would like to either contribute content on climate data or in other ways. Our vision is for Data Directory 2.0 to serve as a global public good.
So I hope you enjoyed that video, and allow me to wrap up. Setting aside the various upgraded functionalities that I've mentioned, I want to say that the key innovation of the Data Directory 2.0 is community. Our solution to closing data gaps is your participation, to share what you know and what you have with the wider community. Data Directory 2.0 is merely a tool that facilitates the exchange of information. Anyone can participate in it. Anyone can also access the ready stock of information that the NGFS members have already curated on the directory. And anyone can access the information that interested commercial data providers have already committed to put on the data directory. We've already commenced a lot of work, both with commercial data providers as well as standard setting bodies, so that they can post and bulk post data on the data directory. If you are hearing about the Data Directory 2.0 for the first time and you would like to participate in some capacity, please reach out to the NGFS Secretariat. We're always glad to work with you. You may be a data provider or you may be interested to host the data directory. Please reach out. We hope to see you as part of the Data Directory 2.0 community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harry Lee. Thank you very much. Before we start now into our high-level panel with the trillion dollar question, how to mobilize the trillions, you know, all the zeros. Who needs an espresso? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So Ali, please already get it going. We have a 15-minute coffee break. The first 8 or so espressos are already in the making. And then I'll see you back 5:45 with our high-level panel. I'm looking forward to see you soon. Enjoy your coffee. Thank you.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
And with that, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, here at the German Climate Pavilion. It's such a pleasure to see you. Thank you for making time and space in your busy calendars once again. It's a real pleasure and honor to have you here. As it is a busy day here on the Finance Day and an NGFS Finance Day event, we already have started into our afternoon. Into the event by the Network for Greening the Financial System, by the Deutsche Bundesbank, by the Central Bank of the Federal Republic of Germany. And now we are diving into our next panel, into a high-level panel. How to mobilize, and this is not just a $1 million question, but also the $1 trillion question in that regard, how to mobilize the trillions of US dollar for climate finance. And of course, the big question, are we already on the right path for that big change when it comes to system change, when it comes to this new architecture of green finance? Where do we stand on that regard for a greener financial system? And are the trillions, all these zeros, really shifting into the right direction? And for that, I welcome my panelists here on stage, and I do an introduction in a minute, so please join me. Sabine Mauderer, Achim Steiner, Avinash Persaud, Ulrich Streetbeck, and Ambros Fayol. Join me here on stage, and we start together into our introduction. Avinash, would you join me here on the left? Achim, yes. Yeah, voilà. D'accord, merci. How are we doing? It's a busy day, right, for everyone? So yes, next to me, and we are both color-coded in pinkish for the Finance Day. Sabine Mauderer, ladies and gentlemen, the chair of the NGFS Network for Greening the Financial System and the first deputy governor of the Deutsche Bundesbank, the Central Bank of the Federal Republic of Germany. Next to Sabine is Achim Steiner, administrator at the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. We do have on the left-hand side Avinash Persaud, special advisor on climate change of the president at the Inter-American Development Bank, and prior to this position, he has been the special climate envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados. So talking about architecture and building up, really, you were one of the architects of the Bridgetown Initiative. Next to us in the center, Ulrich Streetbeck. You're the head of regulatory and public affairs at Ørsted, a renewables developer. But you really experienced a journey of change, so to say, when it comes into the transformation of your company from a very coal-intense utility to nowadays a green energy major in a decade. So a pioneer of showing that it's all doable. So thanks again for joining. And last but not least, enchanté and bienvenue, Ambros Fayol. Fayol, the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, bringing in here on our panel the role of the Europe Investment Bank. And I love to always use your claim, the Europe's Climate Bank, to give you a new name. And of course, you're one of the most important lenders for climate action. So once again, welcome to the panelists, but also, of course, to new faces. We do have still some seats, so join us in the rows. Sabine, I'd like to start before with you to start into our debate, because of course it is the day, but nevertheless every COP is a finance COP, as you've mentioned previously, when it comes to the movement and the change of the financial system. And you pinpointed some developments already in your speech, but just give us another wrap up. How far has the financial system moved to address the climate risks and to mobilize all these numbers and the zeros and the trillions for the transition? Maybe, give us an idea of where we are in that journey.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Can you hear me, or is it? Do I have to be more louder, or is it okay? It's okay. Good. Yeah, so I think it is, or it was a long journey, and we're still not there, far away from being where we have to be. But I think we saw a major shift. When I started to deal with the subject financing green or the transition or whatsoever, it was more like, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, it was more of, oh my God, we do something nice. Yeah, we have a ESG bond. We want to be on the right side of the population or history and so on. And it was more of, it was not a necessity, but rather something, an addition, or an add-on. And over the years, it has become clear that the transformation, the transition is crucial for surviving, not only for our economies, but our own species, let me put it that way. And so, especially now referring also to the work of the NGFS, as I just said, all our studies show and analysis show that we live in the current policy scenario where we see tremendous, huge damages that lie ahead of us even before 2050. So now, since you are asking me how far is the financial system developed, I would say it's the financial system. When we're talking about finance, it's not only the financial system. It is also the real economy. So it's a mixture of the financial system and the real economy. It's the economy, financial and real economy. And the main shift from, when we started, and there's a lovely thing to have this ESG, to now is that we know that every single industry needs to become carbon neutral. That it has to go to this, it's not possible for all, but for the majority of industries, it's clear that they have to make their journey towards net zero. And so it is not enough to just talk about ESG and green finance. It's rather talk about how do we finance the path for each corporate, for each to manage this transition journey, right? So I think this topic and this mindset of financing green is, and it's not even the right frame anymore. It's about financing to survive, financing to transform in order to save the planet and our species.
Thank you for that first round. Achim, it's a very busy day, of course, because mobilizing the trillions, the how do we do it, that the question about what and how, it's in every corner of this COP. And when we look into Article 2.1c, with the ambition of the Article 2.1c in making these financial flows consistent towards low greenhouse gas emissions, we do see gaps. And of course, the big question is how can we overcome the gaps? UNDP is always, and quite often, a bridge builder and combining different gaps. But what is important for the gaps coming out of the debate around Article 2.1c?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join you here this afternoon. And listening to Sabine, I'm taken back to about 10, 12 years ago, when during my tenure at UNEP, we had the inquiry into greening the financial systems. And it was one of the incubators at the time of a conversation that began to signal how the idea of survival, or of, in a sense, a world that has to move onto a different trajectory, began to interface with the financial system that treated it, as you rightly described it, as something that others should be doing, but we might put a toe in the water. I think we are now at a point where our financial system is being pressurized in two respects, and I think this is perhaps the most hopeful part of how we are going to address this financing gap. One is actually the expectation of those who essentially put their money into this financial system. We often think of them as institutions. The largest part is actually people's pensions, people's savings, and the way that citizens are more and more able to at least play a more informed part in how their money is being deployed is creating this immense amount of money that is looking for purpose as well as profit. put it very simply. And that is changing the outlook also of the commercial financial sector. But let's also be clear, we have still major gaps in the world. Just take renewable energy investments. The IEA says $3 trillion of energy infrastructure investments in 2024. 2 trillion of those will actually be renewables. Only 1% or less will land on the continent of Africa. So the geography, first of all, is one challenge. How do we bring the world's financial system to actually bring money to where it is most needed? And I think here we have to recognize that this cannot just be a matter of voluntary commitments. I think we have to create the regulatory and also more structured incentive systems that allow capital to find its way to those destinations. I'm always struck by the debate that often looks at China today. How is China managing to invest so much in green energy, get the EV revolution underway in less than 2 decades? You know, most of this goes back to a decision that China took roughly 15 years ago to start investing and creating a green financial system, including how the People's Bank of China and the commercial banks would create a capital flow that had to find a destination. And I think this is very crucial. Very briefly, the other aspects are, I think we have to move from the MDB focus right now, which is good, welcome, the announcements here also very important, to an NDB, enhanced focus, national development banks. The larger multiplier that can build on where the MDBs have signaled more investment, more ability to invest, the Climate Bank of Europe. How can we translate that into the hundreds of national development banking institutions that can be pioneers at national level, attract also a significant amount of this finance? And then thirdly, we have to deal with the issue of debt. We are essentially preventing countries right now from accessing the capital that might be available simply because they can no longer afford to borrow. So these are 3 directions in which I would say we can make a difference. And they are very
And you get cheering already, yes. Wonderful. Thank you, Achim, for pinpointing your 3 most important points and, of course, the priorities that you're fighting for. Ambros, I'd like to, before we talk about geographies of investment flows in a second, I'm coming back to you, but I'd like to firstly start with Ambros, Vice President of Europe's Climate Bank. When it comes of the to-dos, and of course, Achim and Sabine already mentioned a lot that needs to be done when it comes to the perspectives of multilateral development banks. Where has EU's climate bank used and managed to create innovative mechanisms to be on that path, to be on the journey of survival, as Sabine mentioned, when it comes to advisory services and really to mobilize and leverage finance?
I'll come to that, but let me answer also Achim's point on MDBs and how we need to broaden it, our action.
Just a quick heads up, sorry, because I can't hear anything on that side. Just to our technical team in the background, can you give us a little bit more volume to the boxes here that are actually standing towards us? Thank you.
It's okay? Yeah. I must say that I'm impressed by the work that MDB has done over the last years, and actually also thanks to a gentle push from various communities and from our shareholders in order to increase volumes and to increase and to improve transparency, accountability, how we do our work to be more Paris-aligned, these kind of things. The announcement that was done here, I repeat it, $120 billion by multilateral development banks committed to low and middle income countries by in 2030 is something that is a big improvement. It's a big increase. Year after year, MDBs are delivering record levels of financing. That's something that is excellent. It has to be accompanied, I agree, with strong increases from the national provincial banks, from the structure that we can find in de-risking the private sector, innovative financing. I mean, Avinash know that we have a great project in EIB in Barbados, where together with IDB and the Green Climate Fund, we have actually open fiscal space, because one of the big problems in many of these states is they have big needs, they don't have fiscal space to implement them. So the idea is to buy back a bond that was an expensive one with a bond that is guaranteed by institutions that are public, so that you have a lot of fiscal space that is created, and with that money, the Barbadian government is going to build a wastewater and waste plants that is climate resilient, which is one of the big issues in Barbados. These kind of initiatives have to be developed.
They have to be developed, or they are already on the way? Sorry.
Yeah, this one is on the way. We need to see more.
We need to see more, okay.
And actually, one of the things is also the IMF Resilience and Sustainability Trust that has been put in place creates also fiscal space for that.
Maybe just one suggestion. There are some seats available in the front, so maybe you can come on here to.
Oh, you can hear as well. I think it's rather on our side.
I invite you to come closer. And secondly, I think it's really important that, please have a seat in the front. Please do so. You sure? Especially women are encouraged to sit in the first row, so please. And free drinks are delivered, so extra coffee I promise. So.
But just to mention, just to clarify, is it okay with the audio right now in the back?
It is?
Perfect.
Okay, good.
I think it's reflect because we have a different reflection of the audio here.
Sorry.
No, nevertheless. Wonderful. Okay, so we need to have more. There are some instruments and mechanisms on the way. Nevertheless, Avinash, I'd like to come to you, and I don't forget you, but bear with me. We have so many panelists and so much to talk about. Avinash, when we talk about the geographies of investment and the geographies of especially local investment, and maybe you can also draw your experience from Barbados into your answer, into the fabric of your answer, a country that we all know that is directly and really severely affected and impacted by climate change. When it comes to foreign direct investment and local investment, it's not enough. Nevertheless, with the geographies and the mechanisms that are on the way, where do you see the priorities? Because everybody is talking about investment and how to leverage investment. Let's get a clear picture for us. What is meant and what is best to really structure and strengthen the green finance architecture?
Thank you very much. I think a very important way of framing this problem, can you hear me okay? I think a very important way of framing this problem is thinking in terms of the cost of capital. So we now have, over the past 10 years, renewable energies have become profitable, commercially viable in developed countries where the cost of capital is relatively low. The same technologies, the same contracts are not profitable in developing countries because the cost of capital is 2, 3, 4 times more. But what do we mean by the cost of capital, and why is the cost of capital so high, and what are the solutions? Because some of the solutions my friends have mentioned here might actually make the cost of capital worse. So what are we trying to do? Cost of capital is about the fact that in developing countries, almost by definition, these are countries without a lot of cash. They've got low savings and high investment demand. Low savings, high investment demand, capital is scarce, so the cost is high. Developed countries have much more savings and perhaps a little bit less of the investment demand because of their pace of growth, and so capital is abundant. So we have this cost of capital issue. Now, funding more of the projects locally by national development banks and others, for example, the challenge of that is we're going to add even more challenge to the cost of capital because we're going to have even more investment demand. We need to build a channel between the places with abundant capital to the places with scarce capital. And when we do that, we find that capital is not flowing. So why is the capital not flowing? What are the obstacles? So what about the greening of financial standards? Because we must green financial standards. It's a good thing to do. It's not going to improve the flow of capital, because when we actually look at the actual risks in emerging markets, what the credit rating agencies are telling us, these risks are high. No, we can't hide from them. We have to have them. We need to see them, but that's not helping my flow of capital. We find that one of the biggest obstacles to the flow of capital is a foreign exchange risk. Because when you're dealing with renewables, very different from fossil fuels, renewables earn their revenues in local currency. The capital we're getting from is overseas in dollars or euros. And the people who hedge the foreign exchange, the banks, we have a market structure problem, find it very hard to manage that risk. Banks are short-term, renewable energies are long-term, 25-year risks. Banks have pro-cyclical risks, and emerging markets have even more pro-cyclical risks. So the banks charge a big risk premium. And then here's the other thing in which Sabine and others can help us with. Because the other obstacle is regulation in developed countries. If you are an insurance company and a pension fund, I think both Sabine and I can mention trying to get pension funds and insurance companies in developed countries, Solvency II and Basel III actually require them to have higher capital requirements because, not of risk, but because of geography, because they're not OECD countries. Even when we put a guarantee around where we put more credit enhancement, because it's non-OECD, 3 times more capital for an insurance company to invest in it under Solvency II, so they're not investing. So let us find ways of unblocking the flow of capital, create a level playing field, and that's the way we'll get the trillions flowing.
Thank you, because this gives me the perfect keyword now to join and to come to Ulrich when it comes to being courageous for risk, right? Because Ørsted is now the world's largest developer of offshore wind power. But when we look into the history, completely different story. A natural gas company, when we look into the history book of the company. So when we talk about facing the risks of the transition, what made you so courageous? And of course, what made you to shift your activities towards offshore wind? And when it comes to leveling the playing field, what you were just mentioning between fossil fuels and renewable technologies, what helped you on the way?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for hosting this great panel. I'm learning a lot and very inspired by what you are saying. So first, to your question, if you promise you can keep a secret, I will confess that our decision to turn and become a completely different company, it was not out of brilliance or clear-sightedness and a little bit of bravery, I would say, though. It was, as change often is, decisions made on an absolutely burning platform. We had a business within burning coal and within using gas that was not going well, and we needed to change our company. We wanted to change it as well. Everyone going to work in my company over the last 15 years have clearly felt better and wanting to do what we did, but we were acting on a burning platform, and I think that's it's also a important and realistic conclusion that this is where people move. Secondly, on that journey before moving into the future, but on our history, I would say when it comes to the finance side, I think we have on our journey taken many bold, probably quite risky decisions. We have made many mistakes, but we have also succeeded in doing some bold things. on the finance side, I'm not a finance person, but it is something about getting someone else's money, and that someone else expects to get the money back with an interest. So the business has to go well. And here I think we made some innovation in getting particularly pension funds, but also other institutional investors on board and actually taking the time to understand our business. They set up departments, they took on board people that actually spend the time understanding offshore wind. And it sounds simple, but it was actually very, very innovative. So that was that, and that was our experience. Looking forward, moving from the millions to the trillions, a lot of things have to go well, and there is particular issues around developing countries, I think, where we also have to remember that, of course, it's about green finance, but it's also about financing a modern energy supply, because this is the preferred choice anyway. So it's about also development. And here I would say that at least in some parts of the world, certainly Europe, we are facing a new type of risk that the finance world, also the public side, will have to grapple with. And that is that when I make an investment decision today, multi-billion euro investment decision, it is for a facility that I actually don't know whether there is a customer for when I make the decision, because it is to fuel electrification, transformation of the industrial demand, and that is not happening yet. We have to trust that that will happen. So I do think, as a part of the $1 trillion question, we also have to understand that risks are changing. The type of risk is changing, so we will need, in our view, new measures also to manage that risk, accept that risk, to only be able to say, it's your business, you take care of the risk. We can say that, but then too little will happen, and it will happen too late.
Sabine, I'm coming to you in a second, but you mentioned a lack of understanding. Who needs to talk to each other more than ever before? Because if you're speaking about a lack of understanding, some people don't talk to each other.
I frankly think, but again, I'm not a banker or a pension fund manager. Actually, I think we've done that. I think the knowledge today is now there. In any financial institution will know what they're dealing with here. So I think we can tick that, actually.
Okay. Sabine, what is the point where you agree or where maybe you disagree?
No, first of all, I would like to thank Ulrich for being here, because I think your contribution is so important, because of most of us here representing the public sector, and we have, some vision of what we would like to be, not we ourselves, but the world to be, and how this all has to work. But I think who's really the major player in town are the corporates, right? And therefore, I'm so thankful to people like you, Ulrich, that you're here and you're sharing your example. This morning, it was in a meeting also with Guterres, and there was a representative of the furniture industry. I don't want to mention the name, but most of you know that and have that at home, also coming from the Scandinavian area. So, and there actually was a good example of how you, even as a furniture company that is dependent on a supply side globally, reduce your scope 3 emission by 25%, right? So, and not because you want to be a lovely company, but just because of you saving costs, right? And I think this is a great example, and your example as well. So I think it's really crucial that we get much more collaboration and exchange between the public and the private sector, because we have to understand each other. And once again, I think, so the reason why, we know the numbers that are needed, and the question, and you alluded to it, is the question, why do we not, money is around, right? Especially also on the private sector. The public sector, it's less and less because there are so many threats and challenges globally and increasingly. So I think that it is really important that we mix those two resources, the public money on the one hand, and that must be used to trigger the private money. Because as many of you said, is in the final row, a private investor has to make a decision. Is this investment worth it? And there are two questions an investor has to ask him or herself. That's first, what about the risk, and what is about the return? And if the risk and the return are not profitable, are not beneficial, then no investor can make this decision. But in the end, there has to be something in for him or for her. So, and I think this is the major task of finance, be it adaptation finance, be it transformation finance, be it carbon capturing, whatsoever. In the end, we have to reduce risk and increase returns. And maybe in this regard, I think the tool we have mentioned in the previous panel, but once again, I would like to mention, blended finance is one of those tools that is a promising tool. So far, we have to work on the setting because it is not a new tool. We know it for more than 20 years, but there's so many obstacles, and I think we have to talk about that. But I think that also our representative from the EIB can help us in this regard.
Absolutely, thank you. Before I open the floor, Ambros, and then of course you were disagreeing at one point.
I wouldn't say disagree,
Ambros,
but just to add a little flavor. I think that 10 years ago, the structure was that what we needed to do was not commercially very viable. We needed to add a public subsidy to it. And that's where the blended finance approach came. The blended public plus private together, we would get this done. I think the technology has now changed. Perhaps courtesy of China, we've had a collapse of these costs. This is now viable. The challenge is there's stuff that we need to do for climate that doesn't have a revenue. So we need to split what we need to do in terms of stuff with revenues, which the private sector needs to do, stuff with savings but no revenues, which the public sector needs to lend, public long-term low cost, and stuff where there's no revenues and there's no savings. Much of the savings bit looks like adaptation. Seawalls, flood defenses, drainage systems, no revenues, lots of savings. But then there's stuff, poor communities wiped out from a flood, that no debt is going to solve that problem. No private sector will solve that problem. We need additional public revenues, maybe through additional levies, global solidarity levies, etc.
Thank you for this addition. But Ambros, we were talking about, of course, de-risking the investment possibilities for the private sector. How are you support, or how can the European Investment Bank support here?
I mean, that's what we do in our daily projects that we finance. It's basically combining public resources with private ones to have leverage, and that's what we try to have, leverage. Now, I was impressed in New York at the Climate Week by the fact that there were a lot of discussions about have we reached the tipping point when it will be less interesting to invest in fossil fuel projects, also because of stranded assets discussions, and more interesting in renewable energy because also of, as you said, the collapse in prices. And a lot of them are becoming profitable. And that's what we see, I think. And that's what I think is we have reached this tipping point. And this is a sort of revolution in the finance of energy projects in the world. That's very good news. What is less good news to me is indeed adaptation, because unfortunately climate change is already there. You will need to adapt. And of course, those who have to adapt the most are those who have the least revenues. And it is also biodiversity. I was in Cali. Frankly speaking, nature and biodiversity is not considered as important as as climate mitigation, and it is wrong. Also because with nature projects, you could reach 30% of the targets that you need for climate mitigation. So we need to do more on renewable energy projects, but actually with innovation, I think it's on the good way. Adaptation, we need absolutely to put adaptation in everything we do, and we need to do more on nature and biodiversity and environment.
Absolutely, thank you, Achim. That brings me, of course, to a question. We had just a COP in Cali. Now we are here in Baku. We have the soil COP coming up, the UN Water Conference next year. So all these issues, they need, of course, finance. And when it comes to building up the architecture, again, I use that term of green finance. It should be interconnected. So what is the way forward, also from a UNDP position and perspective?
I'm not sure UNDP would have a position on all of these issues, but let me take the advantage of speaking as an individual also. And I want to borrow a little bit of my colleagues here, not because I disagree with them, but the first thing I need to pick up on, because I think I want to come back to the systemic nature of this financial system. Now, Avinash, you spoke earlier on about developing countries. I think one of the problems is, and you would agree with that presumably, we need to disaggregate this, because what you described as a developing country phenomenon simply doesn't apply to China, nor to India, nor to Brazil. And I was just asking, I think BNDES is actually the largest climate bank in the world, even bigger than EIB, Brazilian National Development Bank. So let's maybe begin to disaggregate a little bit the developing world finance conundrum. The second thing is I want to go back, Sabine, on something that you are very committed to, namely how central banks either embrace or continue to deny their role in addressing some of the most fundamental systemic risks to our financial stability. It's a continued debate. The Bundesbank has been a reluctant player in this. You have been a voice that is trying to address this. The Fed sits in the G20 on the one hand, and you will see Janet Yellen saying we have to embrace these challenges, and the Fed says, well, I'm not sure that we really have anything to do with this. So one of the problems is, until our central banks embrace their responsibility in the 21st century, that the way that they can enable a financial system to grow investment here, to defund investment there, I don't think the financial system is keeping pace with where reality is moving us. Second example, the private sector is not that complicated. You offer them a return on investment, they will invest. I mean, Germany spent 20 years arguing over whether to switch off its nuclear power stations or not. Took another 20 years to decide to switch it off. Then it just introduced one law, because by accident or by democracy, a green environment minister began to drive energy policy. Germany invented something called the feed-in tariff. Suddenly, billions of euros were being invested in a massive expansion of renewable energy infrastructure. In fact, the tariff had been set far too high and guaranteed for 20 years, so Germany was now struggling to figure out how to get off this golden goose that it had created in order to get a more normal market moving. So it's not that complicated. The problem, and I agree with you again, for many poorer developing countries, that capital and that lever may not always be there. But then, let's go back to Bangladesh. When Atiur Rahman was leading the Bangladesh Central Bank, he was actually embracing the responsibility of how a central bank would increase the financial system's willingness to invest in the economy of the poor. Last example, credit rating agencies. We have a totally distorted system of rating risk. It is influenced by the self-interest of the investors, not by the real nature of risk. How else do you explain that the three major credit rating agencies in the world, who determine tens of billions of dollars of additional cost of borrowing money for a continent like Africa, barely have 4 offices in 53 countries? And yet they determine risk across the entire African continent for every capital borrowing decision on a global financial market. And I tell you, it's not mathematics. 50%, even the credit rating agencies will agree, is a methodological approach. The rest is essentially judgment calls. How on earth are they judging the cost of borrowing for Africa to the point where it's prohibitive, as you also called it? So I mention these examples not because they're simple truth and they're never as simple as they sound, but I do think we need to go back to the systemic nature of the levers we have to pull in order to create a financial system that is geared towards investing the things that we need. And if you want a last example, I just say subsidies. Do we have to say anything else? Perverse subsidies. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Following that, the New York Times reported about another possibility to mobilize climate funding, and it comes to the special drawing rights. So, Sabine, how would you perceive that? That, you know, also the special drawing rights might be a possibility to support in that regard and to build up for another. You're laughing. It is a hot topic, I know, but to build up the green financial architecture of the future.
Yeah, sure.
As if you had already retired from the Bundeswehr.
No, I think we need all efforts to do that. And as was said, I think there are different levels of challenges. So let me just put it that way. I think that we need, as Achim said, first of all central banks to be convinced that climate is something that each central bank, because I do not know any mandate of any central bank where climate is excluded, because climate is a financial risk. And per se, this is the mandate of each and every central bank. So I think this is clear. And this has nothing to do with mission creep and so on. When it comes to actually what kind of program does the central bank support, I think then you have to distinguish between your mandate and your not mandate, because they differ from jurisdiction to jurisdictions. And secondly, I think what is really important is that you always have a look at what challenges do you have in general. Do you have poverty? Do you have climate, nature, equality, EDG, or whatsoever? And we need to really have a clear vision of which funds need to be addressed by whom. And this, I think, really important thing to distinguish.
Thank you. I know time is always running away, and we are all busy, and I promise to stop on time. But allow me one last question to Ulrich, because I assume you get quite a lot of phone calls by other companies with the big question, how did you do it? So again, maybe the secret, what do you tell colleagues from the private sector, how to be bold and how to be courageous when it comes to change completely and to be open for change?
We do get a lot of calls.
See?
That is true. And I have been out visiting our facilities many times, also with governments and other institutions, but certainly also with other companies. I guess that, as I said before, being really seriously on a burning platform, that just keeps you motivated and focused. It's painful, but it just does help. But being willing to take risk, also the risk of failure, and you do make mistakes and have many failures on your way. So in that, a little bit like with governments actually, I also would say that having a strategy with an ambition that you stick to, not too far, but long enough to really be persistent. That is very important. Final word. We can talk about finance. We can talk about Ørsted and the business. At the end of the day, we need a customer who's happy. So, for example, in our case, we developed a product, offshore wind, that we've learned to master, but it was far too expensive. And if we just carried on like that, we would not have a customer, which would be Germany and Denmark and the UK. So we had to bring down the cost really seriously. So also knowing and understanding society and your customer has been absolutely instrumental for us. And in that, maybe as a final final remark, we talked about, you mentioned subsidies. and subsidies is also, it's always a concept that comes out of a design. And in a world where the design is perfect and there is a perfect level playing field, if there is something that is more expensive that you then want to support, you need a subsidy. Our experience is that the playing field is never perfect. The design is never perfect. So subsidies is also a relative thing. And building on that, moving to, I think, Sabine, one of your introductory comments was, you know, we have sort of sorted out the production of renewable energy. Now we know how to do that. Now we come to the decarbonization of particularly large industries, and they need to get on to their journey of electric arc furnaces for steel, hydrogen to make renewable ammonia, and so on and so on. And I think we have to have also respect for that technology journey at that end of the value chain.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. You can ask always a question.
One very quick one, Ulrich, because you describe Ørsted's decisions as driven from within, but since we are talking about financial system now, at what point does your decision intersect, for example, with the customer's ability to access capital at a concessionary rate, or the removal of perverse subsidies that subsidize fossil fuels, making it impossible for you to work? Or did you have to borrow money, and did you get money from government or from banks that lent it to you because of the kind of products you were developing? Or was that financial system, in a sense, marginal to what you were able to do?
Yeah. A very difficult question, particularly in a short period of time. But
2 minutes.
But three comments.
Yeah.
Number one, Ørsted is partly state-owned. Whatever role, impact that has, you tell me. I don't know how investors look at that. I think it makes them more comfortable, probably. Number two, there was a very, very decisive moment in our journey around finance, and that was to get pension funds on board. Otherwise, we would not have made it, I think. And third one, when we had to find investment for, at the time, the largest project we had to take in external finance. Goldman Sachs came on board. It also had to do with finance. The Danish government fell apart over that question. So it was not a small thing. It was an enormous thing. But we made it. We could have failed, but
you need a meeting, you two, definitely. Thank you so much, because people are running away. Merci beaucoup. Thank you to Ambros Fayol, to Ulrich for all your insights, very much to Avinash, to Achim, and of course, last but not least, to Sabine. A round of applause, and I think you need to run off, but we have time for a round of applause. Thank you so much. We are living in exciting times. One last photo, one smile. All right. Okay. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much for taking the time, for staying around. We do have more coffee now around the corner, and it's lovely to see you all. Come by here more often at the German Climate Pavilion, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Hey, hey, hey. So. So. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Stage kann ich ja mal anmachen. Aus Spaß. Aus Spaß. Machen wir die Stage mal an. Eins, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.